Добрый вечер. Меня зовут Сергей Балашов. Спасибо, что смотрите эту трансляцию. Я продюсер проекта издательского дома «Коммерсант», который называется «Университет», тоже с твердым знаком на конце. Это платформа интерактивных онлайн-курсов и онлайн-семинаров. И в феврале мы проводим семинар Ричарда Ньютона под названием «Управление изменениями. Как обеспечить организационный успех цифровой трансформации и справиться не только с технологиями, но и с людьми». И сегодня мы проводим этот эфир, чтобы вы могли...
We're doing this broadcast today in order to introduce Richard, who will be giving this course. He's a consultant from Great Britain. Initially, we thought that this seminar would be most useful to CEOs and heads of divisions in large companies and corporations. And before we talk to Richard and learn from him about his track record, projects he's worked on, consulting companies that go through change, let me say a few words by way of introduction. Richard is founder of a company called Enixus, and he wrote a number of books on project management and change management in organizations. Richard has been running such projects for over 30 years now. He has worked for such consulting companies as Ernst & Young, A.T. Kearney, and his own company, Enixus, has worked for Credit Suisse and under Reuters, BT, and a number of other companies that work in different areas and all over the world, from continental Europe to Malaysia and even Kazakhstan. Richard, we're happy to have you here today. Welcome, and over to you.
Richard, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, Sergey. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me well now that I'm on the English channel and the audience here listens to us via translation. Thanks to our interpreter, Olga.
I can hear you loud and clear. I'm looking forward to talking.
Great. So the first question that I would like to ask you is, could you just tell about your career as a consultant and what's been your focus since starting Enixus, and what kinds of projects do you take to work on?
Okay, Sergey. Yeah, I mean, my company Enixus, I founded back in 2015. No, sorry, 2005, back in February 2005. So it'll be 16 years soon since I founded it. And before that, I had a mixed career in consultancies. I think you mentioned people like A.T. Kearney and Ernst & Young. And then I spent several years in the telecoms industry in senior positions in the telecoms industry. I set up my business for a couple of reasons. One was the type of work I wanted to do, and I saw there was an opportunity in the market to do that. And I'll talk about that in a second. The other point was I really wanted to work for myself, and we may talk about this a little bit later as we go through, because I wanted the flexibility to do some other things that I do, and particularly write. I mean, I spend quite a lot of time writing every year, so I wanted the flexibility of being my own boss to do that. With my company, I focus on a specific area. Now, let me qualify that slightly in that anyone who's ever done any consulting knows that no two projects are the same. They're always different. But my niche I identified 15 years ago was there's a lot of organizations that want to do some change, want to do some transformation, and don't have the full skills or capabilities to do that themselves. And traditionally, what those firms will have done is they would have gone to a major consultancy, the sort of organizations I used to work with, and they would have partnered with them to help them through that transformation for the life of the work. And that's worked well for a lot of firms. But I think a lot of people don't want to have a consultancy partner necessarily, say, for 3, 4, or 5 years. It's expensive. Plus, they want to build their own skills in-house. So I found a niche where there are people I work with who basically want help starting projects, so getting them planned, getting them mobilized, and then want help to build their own capabilities to do the work themselves. And particularly, I help people build project and change management teams. So if you like, my ideal piece of work, my typical piece of work is where I will be engaged at the very start of initiative. And as I say, I will help to plan it out at a high level and help to think about how it gets mobilized. And then quite often I'll run it for a period of maybe 6, 9 months. And in that time, we'll start to bring on board permanent team members in the organization, either through training people who are already in-house or recruiting people. And so people build up their own teams, because the challenge with transformation and change is that it's not a once-off activity. It's things people need to do time and time again. And if you need to do something time and time again, it's best to learn to do it yourself. And so that's what I try to do. And that's what Enixis really focuses on.
Yeah, perfect. Actually, at this point, since the topic of our workshop that I've just announced, which we're going to have in February, is change management, I would actually love to hear how you define change management as a discipline. And also, how often do you think experienced senior managers actually lack these particular competence while being reasonably good at other managerial tasks, so that they need this extra advice and guidance when it comes to managing change?
Okay, two big questions. Let me try and answer them in turn. So how do I define change management? There are lots of definitions of change management. To me, I start with something fairly simple, which is I would say that change management is really about ensuring outcomes are achieved. I mean, that is outcomes in the specific context of wanting the business or an organization to do something differently. And the track record of change in organizations is mixed. Some organizations have proven themselves very good at it, but a lot struggle with it. And change management as a discipline is there really to help people go from, say, A to B, and make sure that if B is where you want to get to, you really get there. And when you get there, that it achieves the things that you want to do. And not only is history shown that change often fails, but history has often shown that even when, for example, projects are delivered, that it doesn't achieve the outcomes that organizations already expected to. So change management provides a wrapper to think about all the different aspects that might add risk or complexity to achieving a change, and helps organizations go through to achieve them. I mean, there's a huge detail of complexity and different disciplines and tools within change management, but essentially it's there. It's about reducing risk and achieving outcomes is how I think about it. I have to stress, different people involved in change management might give you a different discipline, but to me, that's the best discipline because it really relates to what a business needs, which is risk reduction and achieving of outcomes. Your second question, piece about are senior managers, even good senior managers, good at change management? I think this is something that's changed. If you had asked me this question 20 years ago, I would have said generally no. I think over the last 20 years or so, the relevance of change and change management and the importance of it being not just a discipline that external experts like myself do, but as a core competence of every manager and every leader in an organization. I think that realization has happened. And so more and more time is spent focusing on building change management skills. So I think it's better than it used to be. I nevertheless, there is definitely a gap. And let me think. I mean, I can typify that in two ways. I certainly know many excellent people, strategists, for example, really excellent strategists who can come up with great visions and great plans for organizations of the future, things that will really drive organizations to success. But whilst they're good at the visioning, they're not really good at the execution. And there's that gap between that ability to think for the future and actually execute. And I think that's one example where there's often a gap. At the other side, I think there's also a lot of operational managers and those who run operational functions in businesses from COOs downwards will know that, one of the things that often drives great operations is a degree of stability. I mean, obviously operations are all sorts of things going on, but we want to have reliable, well-trusted processes, systems, and tools, and successful operations often rely on that sort of stability. There have been tools and techniques like Lean and Six Sigma that drive change in operations, but they tend to do it in an incremental fashion, sort of continuous improvement. And there is a tension between great operations and sort of really transformational change, and certainly doing it at pace. So often operational managers struggle with change because it's not ingrained into their way of thinking, which is more orientated to performance improvement in the operational sense. So yeah, I think there's lots of managers, both on the strategic side and the operational side, who are really good at their job but aren't good at change. I don't think it's true of all of them, and I certainly know exemplars in my network. I know some brilliant strategists who are also good at execution, and I know some great operational leaders who are great at change. But definitely, if on average there's a challenge there, and I suppose that's good for someone like me because that's where my work is, and that's how I help. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Would it be fair to say that so there are, like you've also mentioned just now, there are like different ways you might define change itself, and while there is this idea that ideally an enterprise should be continuously improving and running iterations and learning to do things better. And that idea is encompassed in approaches such as Lean, where like finding little incremental improvements is almost like institutionalized, right? And like everybody just does it. Then there is a different kind of change where something drastic happens in terms of a new threat or an opportunity, and the organization is like conceiving like a major change in how things are done. And that's the kind of changes that you help manage. And that you
absolutely, that's absolutely right. I mean, it's that where an organization needs to fundamentally do something different. I mean, at one level, all organizations are changing all the time, and there are various tools to do that. And for example, you take something like Lean. Lean is an absolutely fantastic approach, but it is driven at that sort of continuous improvement level. And as you say, occasionally something comes along, at the moment is a great case in point, coronavirus pandemic, which really, really challenges some organizations, and no amount of incremental improvement is going to get you through that challenge. Sometimes you need to do something faster, more radical, more fundamental. And that's the sort of change I tend to be involved in. Sometimes it's technology led. In fact, very often in my career, it's had a technology angle, but not always. Not always. There might be other drivers as well, such as moving to different locations for cost reasons, or trying to adapt organizational culture for a variety of reasons. So it is those more radical style of changes where the end result is a very different organization from the one that started.
I see. Would you say that, I'm curious to talk about the technology-driven changes that you've mentioned, because just by, two sources that I mainly have, namely observing how a certain consumer enterprise, that's like a retail bank, suddenly, or like a healthcare system, suddenly adopts a new technology, and what happens, and how the frontline employees are dealing with it. So from those observations, and just from the mere like business book titles that keep coming up, I have an impression that very often the management of people in such transformations lags behind the actual technological implementation. So maybe the new system is there, but all the people who work with it in the company have to actually learn to use it so that the productivity actually increases and not the other way around. So up to a point where even I don't quite remember who's been the commentator on this, but recently I heard this idea of a J curve, basically. So when you adopt, okay, there's a mirror image, but if you imagine English letter J, basically the idea is that you adopt a new technology and then you expect a dramatic productivity increase, and there is this dip which happens first and maybe then it goes up. So am I correct in this assumption that very often what you are also called in to work with are some of the managerial challenges that sort of accompany bringing in new technology?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very core aspect of the work. And it's a really good example, because if you think about technology, and you can do lots of fantastic things with technology, but unfortunately what often happens is people get very excited with the technology, and that in itself has its own challenges. Anybody who's tried to deliver a big complicated system knows that, just developing the system has complications, but the system doesn't work on its own. And often what a change manager is doing is looking at that and asking the question, okay, for this to work, what else needs to change? What else needs to be done? And a big aspect of that is people, because at some point, no matter how much automation you put in, it touches onto a person. And, the classic thing will be, do they know how to use the new system? How does it change their job? How are they going to respond to that change? Does it change performance indicators? So there's a whole range of things around. And at extreme, it can do things like, do we need to completely re-alter the organization because the way this system works and the ways of working embedded in it are completely different from the way we work now? And that's something that's changed over my career. If I went back 30 years ago, systems were generally designed to automate the way people worked. Whereas, it's become more and more common, for a lot of good reasons, for people to change their way to working based on what technology can do. And that changing of the ways of working is very much where the change management space is. So although I'll be keeping an eye on the technology, my primary role is often not to deliver that. That's generally a technical role, but to support that with making sure all the other things that need to change in line with that. And that starts by literally assessing, if we're going to implement this system, what other things need to change. And that can be quite complicated to determine in its own right. Modern organizations, big organizations, are very complex beasts, and no one really knows how every aspect of an organization works. Think of your own job. There's probably lots of things you just take for granted that nobody's ever written anywhere. And if you change things, those things have a habit of stopping working. So the change manager attitude is, well, how can I keep this working? What else needs to adapt to do that? So, the sit data is a really good classic example of the sort of things that needs to happen with technology. But technology can be very broad. It is often IT systems, but not just that. You install new machinery on a factory floor. That machinery may work in a different way, may need people with different skills, and may need redesign of factory layouts and things like that. And that's all change, and that's all related to change management. So to think of technology in the broadest sense, albeit at present, a lot of that is digital technology, but also things like robotics and stuff like that, and how that impacts the way people work. The way of thinking about it is twofold. One is, as you make the change, avoiding any disruption, because change often brings disruption to organizations, and it's the last thing they generally want. And as the change, in the sense of, as to say, an IT system is delivered, how do we make sure it performs in the way that we've wanted it to do, and achieves those outcomes and those benefits that justify the investment we've made? And that's very much the space of change management. Does that help?
Well, yeah, but actually I would like to follow up, for instance, on trying to avoid disruption. So would it be fair to say that it's more about minimizing it? Because frankly, there's probably gonna be a certain level of disruption, and I'm not sure how you can.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you're saying, and this is a thing that depends on context. And there's a very simple, it's too simple, but it helps a model. When I'm talking to people about change, I draw a straight line and say, You can go very quickly and spend very little money and you get lots of disruption. Or you can take forever and spend a huge amount of money to get zero disruption. And for most organizations, it's a balancing point between one and the other. But it does depend on what you're doing. You know, if you imagine if you were a nuclear power plant and you're driving change, then you want to be really down the end, which is going slowly and carefully and making sure nothing's disrupted. If you're a very small business, you can probably take more risk. You know, maybe you've got 50 people sitting in a single office. When something goes wrong, you can just sit there and fix it. So you're going to take more risk. And you know, there's different organizations that are a whole spectrum on that. One of the challenges at the moment, for example, is in financial services. You know, we know lots of fintech firms are coming in disrupting the banks, but there are certain challenges for banks to change. And that's not just about their own capabilities. It's also about things like regulation and customers' expectations, because nobody wants, for example, to risk not being able to get access to their money. I mean, I'm taking an extreme example, but it does mean that somebody like a bank has some extent their hands tied by the pace with which they go, because they need to be careful. If, on the other hand, I'm a supermarket chain, I may be willing to take a bit more risk. So it just depends on the nature of the organization, how much risk I'm going to take. And depending on that, you're going to do more or less change management. Yeah, and that is, as I said at the beginning, it's a risk mitigation exercise. And for some organizations, it's absolutely appropriate to take plenty of risk. For some other organizations, it's completely wrong to take plenty of risk. So it's about finding the right balance for the individual organization.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So as I believe nowadays, change management has become somewhat of a buzzword just because people observe how rapidly markets are changing and new technology arrives and it disrupts an industry or a certain market. What would be your personal 3 or 4 tips about doing change management right that are not often stressed in your opinion, but which do you think are really important for us?
Okay, it's a really great question. It's a tough question. I mean, you're absolutely right. Change management is everywhere. There's books. You can log on to any social media or business site and you'll find lots of people chatter. And there are a lot of things that are said everywhere and the same messages. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes I don't think they're right. If you wanted me I'll tell you 3 things that are close to my heart, and they're 3 things that I often stress with my clients, and let me explain them one by one. So, I mean, the first thing is when people go into change, they're often very, very focused, not surprisingly, on where they want to get to. What is the end result that we want to achieve? And one of the things I always ask people I work with to do is to say, just take a little time to think about what you don't want to change. And that may seem like an odd thing to say, but the reason is this, is when you go through change, often unexpected consequences happen. Things break. You know, I've got to be careful of military analogies, but it is the analogy of collateral damage, as it's called, where you get to an outcome that you didn't want. And let me give you a very simple example. It's almost too simple, but I think it helps to understand. Imagine an organization which has a great working culture. You know, it's very productive, it's got good teams, people love working there. And let's say this organization has to go through some change, maybe because of the pandemic or something else. And people focus on the change and they make the change, and maybe the change is successful. But when they look back, they don't have that great culture anymore. They don't have that great team. They don't have those productive workers because something has broken. And if you don't focus as much on what you want to keep, what's really valuable and important about your organization, there's a danger that it gets broken on the way. We have an expression in English, you throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, you lose what's really valuable in your organization. So first lesson, don't just think about what you want to change. Think about those things that you want to stay the same. Now, you've got to be careful because that can become an excuse for not changing anything, and that's not what I'm saying. But in most organizations, there's a few really important things that differentiate the organization or drive value, and we've got to be focused on them as well to make sure they don't break. So that would be the first one. Second one is there's a lot of emphasis in change management on leadership communications. So that's about developing communications, having the right messages, projecting them in the right way. And you'll find communication specialists who will help all sorts of organizations with this. And I can't deny that communications is important, but what often gets forgotten is behavior is even more important. You know, as human beings, we are extremely adept at watching behavior and seeing the difference between behavior and what people say. You know, the do what I do, don't do what I say. Well, people prefer to follow people who do what they say they want other people to do. And so this behavior is extremely important. And again, a very simple example, but you see it quite often. Let's say because of changes in a market, an organization needs to cut costs. So there's a great focus on costs. And so lots of messages go out about cutting costs, but at the same time, everybody knows that the leadership team is having a huge party or buying themselves new cars. And the problem that happens, they may well be justified in having a party or having new cars, but it undermines the message you're saying because people see that there's a mismatch. And this is, I used to just think we were clever at it, but I think increasingly as I've read evolutionary biology, we've kind of evolved to follow behavior more than we've evolved to follow what people say. So we're kind of evolutionary attuned to watching other people's behavior. So when leadership teams learn the right messages, they also need to take on board that the behavior when they're at work needs to align with those messages. And if it doesn't, it's really going to undermine the messaging, and you might as well not bother. Now, obviously not all leaders are observable by all staff, but generally in most organizations, enough leaders are. And everybody on this call will know the situation where, you know, we've all experienced it. You're in the room, you're having a cup of coffee with one of your colleagues, and they're talking about a message that's come up. Will everybody please do X, whatever X is? And yet everybody knows that some senior executive precisely doesn't do X. And that weakens the message and it makes it harder to change. So I think focus on behavior as much as messaging it would be my second thing. And you don't often get people talking about that. And the third thing I think I'd pick on is there's often a very simplistic view of middle management. Yeah. And if you read change management books or you read people talking about change, they'll often talk about middle management as the layers in the organization that get in the way of change. Yeah. And I personally have, my experience is that's wrong. They may be the layers that get in the way, but if they get in the way, they're getting in the way often for good reasons, often because they actually understand the details of how the organization works. Sometimes, of course, it's not in their interest to change, and then you have to think about that. But often it's because the change has not thought about all the details through. And the most successful changes I've seen always take the middle management with them. And I think the most successful organization that changed don't think of the middle management as a problem, but they see the middle management as an opportunity. Because if you get your middle managers on board, if you get them excited by change, it's actually really easy to change because they are the people who are actually running all the bits and pieces of the organization on a day-to-day basis. And so getting those people on board. So, three things that I would say, kind of let me summarize again. Firstly, think about what you don't want to change as well as what you do. Secondly, really, really focus on behavior. Try and cut out any behavior that's not consistent with the messaging. And thirdly, see your middle managers as an asset that can be used to help drive change, not as a problem that just gets in the way. That would kind of be three things I'd pick up. I'm not saying any of them are easy to do, but then the most powerful things in life are not always easy to do. But those are the things I would focus on. Yeah.
I wonder if like the first point also involves, learning, just taking the aspects that you're going to be focusing on. I mean, like, let's make it more concrete. Like, let's say there's a retail chain and they want to offer like delivery service that runs via a mobile app.
Yeah.
Something that we actually had during this month. And maybe there are like some unintended consequences of that change that have been studied by people who have like observed those kind of changes in different organizations, and that those people should educate themselves on. Do you have like actually maybe like your own little library of unintended consequences that just tend to arise in a certain kind of transitions that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to list them all out, but you're absolutely right. There are things, you know. I mean, the interesting thing about these is you often don't need an expert to come and tell you them. Yeah, what you often need is to listen more intently to your own organization, because there's normally somebody there, if you say, we're going to do X, who will be going, you do know if you do X, Y is going to happen. And one of the great challenges, or one of the great balancing acts in change management, is a lot of people don't like change. It's threatening and it's risky, and therefore people will throw up challenges all the time. And one of the great skills is to be able to sift through what you might call background noise. This is just people chatting. This is just people moaning, from no, that person is raising a really excellent complication. You know, if you take your example, we're going to order food from a mobile app. Well, how are we going to get it in the vans? Well, maybe we're going to get one of our staff to go around the shop and fill up a trolley and then stick it on the van. I mean, that's quite often how it's done. And then, you know, have you actually thought about staffing rosters? Have you thought about who actually does this? Are they motivated? You know, it just has more complications. So it is often just about thinking those things through. And it's not about stopping firms making change. It's about making sure you've thought through the implications. Again, not just for thinking through the implications, because it adds risk to achieving your outcome. Yeah. You know, you often see, for example, changes to sales forces where incentives change. So salespeople are incentivized on a different basis. And, you know, people do what they're incentivized for. You get the results that you wanted. I mean, a classic case in point in the UK was in the health service. There was a political push to reduce waiting times in hospitals. Okay. So everybody started measuring waiting times, and it was performance measured on all the hospitals, and magically the waiting times declined. Great. But the quality of treatment didn't get improved. So what was happening is they were processing people quickly, not treating them, but just saying, great, you can come back in 3 weeks' time when we've got a gap. But they had reduced the waiting time. And it's that sort of, let's think through what behavior, what you're trying to do is going to drive. And performance measures are always one of the most interesting. You get what you measure, but really think about, is that really what you want? Because it often goes further than you might have expected. Yeah.
Yeah. Just taking a little takeaway from what you've just said and from the example. I mean, economists often write about those kind of things. So it makes sense to think, how would a particular change in how the company as a whole operates, make sense to think of how would that affect every employee's incentives, and see if their new incentive structure would actually motivate them to contribute their best to the company or not. Right.
Yeah, and I think I've got to stress that you need to do it on a balanced risk view, by which I mean you can analyze these things forever. And of course, as a change manager, I'm never being, nobody's hiring me to do the analysis. They're hiring me to reduce risk. So there is an element of making a judgment-based view on where should we focus, what things are we really worried about may be problematic, and what no. You have to cut corners and make judgments on those. And I think experience helps with that. One of the classic examples where I talked about the need to listen and the need to understand how an organization works at some level is when a new management comes in. So for example, perhaps there's been a private equity buyout of a firm and new managers come in to drive a certain performance. They often get unexpected consequences because they don't understand how the organization works together, and they haven't really worked out how things fix and break. And I'm not criticizing private equity in that sense, but what I'm saying is they need to be careful when they go in driving changes in organization that you precisely get those unintended consequences because you don't understand the details and you're not listening necessarily to middle managers. Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah, somewhat. Like, I mean, whenever you give me more details, I sort of come up with more questions to ask, which makes it a good point that if you are listening with great interest to the conversation right now, please consider the program of the actual interactive workshop that we've put together with Richard, and that is going to take place on February 5th, 25th rather, excuse me, where we would have actually people interact and be solving case studies and finding different approaches and get feedback from Richard on how certain measures might work or backfire. Which brings me to my next question and a larger topic that we've planned in advance. And that is talking about digital transformations. Now, the term has become quite a buzzword. So, and a digital transformation is something that like every company feels they absolutely need to go through. Now, I mean, when everybody talked about how IT sector is where it's at, they came to existence this perception that whenever a company has an app on the App Store, they are like an IT company, which is probably not the case. Now, talking about digital transformations, you've been involved in some. How do you actually define the term, and how do operations of a company that's undergone this look different from a company that hasn't undergone a digital transformation, really? Even
okay, I suppose I'm gonna say a couple of things, and let me just work my way into answering that question in a few steps. I mean, the first thing I'm going to say about digital transformation is let's not think about firms. Let's think about people, from individual people. And certainly in the UK, you have this concept of digital natives. So, you know, people who have grown up in the digital era, for whom digital technology is just the norm. It's there, they're attuned to it, it's intuitive, they use it all the time, as opposed to, say, people, you know, maybe my age group and upwards, for whom certainly when I started working, there was no digital technology, so you're not digital native. Now, I don't want to make that generalize too much, because certainly I've got a friend who's 72, who's probably the biggest geek in the world and knows every aspect of every piece of technology, but you get that general trend. So let's just generalize from that, from people to organizations. And so the first thing to understand is there are organizations that don't need to do digital transformation, plenty of them, because they were born in the digital era. They are digital inherently. And certainly if you look at financial services, you've got lots of modern fintech firms coming in who from day one, they have been digital firms. Now, you know, what that means is it means a whole host of different things, but, you know, you can say generally they're leveraging technology. But if you just think about it as technology, it tends to be operating systems and ways of working. So we tend to align it with things like operating models, which are quite agile and flexible. We tend to think about an attitude towards interaction with the customer and using data. So it kind of brings a host of themes together. But the important point that I'd say there is that the thing about digital transformation is if you're doing a digital transformation, and most of the clients I work with are doing digital transformations now, and even if they don't label it as digital transformation, it's probably got big aspects of it, you know, like they're doing robotic process automation or whatever. You're already slightly behind the curve, because there's those new firms out there who are not transforming because they're already there. And you see this in the banking sector with the, you know, as I say, the fintechs who are snapping around at the big traditional banks and you know, in some cases threatening them. You know, I'm not a financial services strategist, but you can see that that's happening. So firms need to think about this digital transformation. And it really does mean a million different things. And I'm not trying to avoid answering the question, but one of the things I often find is most important to do is when we sit down with organizations doing a digital transformation is to actually start defining terms, to actually sit down and, you know, go through what does this mean for this. And that may just sound like a pointless consulting exercise, but it's really important, because otherwise different parts of the organization tend to break up and start to be going on different journeys because they've interpreted those words in different ways. For one of them, it just means, a digital operating model. So we're all working in agile and flexible ways. Another part, it might be robotic process automation. Another part might be about AI and analyzing customers' data. But somehow these need to come together and produce something that works as an organization as a whole. And I think, you can say something about the organizations that I see that are successful at digital transformations. And I certainly can see about organizations who are not so successful. And, the reality as a consultant, you're often working with the organizations who are not quite so successful. Consultants don't always admit this, but, the really successful firms are doing it. They're doing it now. They're kind of, in the digital space. So it's other organizations that need help. And I think you can see characteristics of the ones that are going to succeed in transforming. And I think the first thing I'd say about the characteristic of the ones that are going to really transform is they are taking it seriously, by which I mean, we know it's a bit of a buzzword. We have this history of buzzwords. My 30-year career, I can, in the 1990s, it was business process reengineering, and then we went through agile, and now we're at business digital transformation. So there is a bit of a buzzword about it, but there is some reality underneath it, some hard reality about the capabilities of technology combined with modern ways of working to drive your organization to a different place and to achieve lower cost, faster pace, a whole variety of things. Now, you've got to be clear about what's important for you in your industry, but those things. And the organizations that are going to win, firstly, are taking it seriously, by which I mean they're actually doing it, they're experimenting and learning, they are investing in digital and moving forward. What they're not doing, which you see some organizations doing, is sort of saying, well, we're going to keep our main organization doing exactly what it is, and we're going to have a little bit over on the side where we're going to dabble in digital. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't be running prototypes and you shouldn't be running experiments on the side, but it can't just be that. There needs to be an intention and a way that you're going to roll it out across your whole organization. Because if you're just focusing on those edge bits, and if you're just doing them to learn, that's fine. But if you're doing them to say, that's us doing digital, then it's not going to work. So I think the first thing is to say, is organizations taking it seriously. And if you look in my domain, the change and program domain, this is not that they have a big portfolio of traditional projects and then somewhere else they have a small portfolio of digital projects. It is that they have one portfolio of projects and they've all got a digital angle on them, and they're coming together into some kind of transformation roadmap. So they're taking it seriously. The other thing I think is that the old-fashioned view that you had a strategy and you went to that strategy and you kept focused on that strategy. Now, we still need a direction. We still need that compass that a good strategy gives us, so we know which direction we're going in. But, the pace of change is such now that as we move forward, that endpoint has probably changed before we've got there. So we need to think about the endpoint not as necessarily as somewhere we're ever going to get to, but as a target that we're aiming at the moment. And what's more important than the endpoint is the transition state. So how we step not from here we are now to that perfect end state, but how we step from here we are now to a midpoint, or even just 10% of the way, but that is better than we are now. And then how we make the next step and how we make the next step. And it's this kind of mentality of continuous transition states that an organization is going through. And in some ways, it was a lot easier when I started out, because when I started out, you ran a transformation, you got to the end of it, and then you thought, right, now let's run the business for 10 years in this new state. Those days are gone. Those days are gone. It's all about transition states, which are just going to be a temporary state, and you're going to be building on from. And that's quite stressful, and it's quite difficult. And it doesn't just rely on technology. I mean, we can all go out and see clever technology. It relies on things like how our culture is as an organization and how we adapt to this, the fact that our people in our organization are up for that. Your job's like this today, but it may be different tomorrow, and it's going to be different again the next day. Now, some people hate that, but unfortunately, that is the way of the world now, and you've got to get used to it. So organizations that understand that and have flexible operating models, I think another key aspect is that the organizations think very, very hard about capabilities. Now, I have a bias towards capability development, but this is not really just about my bias. I think the organizations that I see being successful are not just thinking about the digital technology, but they're thinking about the underlying capabilities in the organization. What is different?
Can I just intervene in that? Just like just prior to this, we were just like, you're using the word capability as a term, which is not easy to map directly onto any one Russian word. So it would be helpful if you explain how you define capability. And that's
yeah, you can get into a whole debate with specialists on the meanings of these words.
Just how you use it. So
yeah, I use that word is if you could drop the caper off the front of it and just talk about an ability to do something, to achieve some goal. So, and for me, those capabilities or abilities, which you might think of as skills and competencies, a lot of them are about people, but not all. And I think of them in two areas when I think about digital transformation. There are those skills, people, organizational structures, operating models, technology as well, that enable us to leverage digital technology to its best. But then there are also the skills associated with things like transformation, change, project management, agile skills, and things like that, which enable us to make the transformation whilst the organization is operating. So it does get quite complicated quite quickly, because one way of thinking about it is if you think of the organization as a giant machine, it's a giant machine which you may be changing any or all of the bits at any point in time. And that can be quite hard to get your head around, but that's the reality of the world we're getting in. And so how you ensure that goes in a direction, and that largely is driven by things like, of course, it's driven by technology and the technology you've got, but it also is driven by the attitudes, the skills of the people you have in your organization, the culture, their ways of working, and how those enable flexibility, enable adoption, rather than every time it gets in the way. I mean, one way of putting it is, in an ideal organization, and this is, somebody like me becomes redundant, because you sometimes need external help to change, but the best organizations have just ingrained that attitude of adopting to change and thinking about change throughout all their staff. And I think of that as a capability, the ability to just flex to the change and the needs as the environment changes and as the vision and the strategy grows. Does that help?
Well, yes, but
and no.
Yeah, as usual, that helps. As soon as I ask a little follow-up question, or rather like about an example. So as you were talking about that, I thought, okay, so for instance, if we have an organization that, sets as its goal the ability to quickly change workflows due to like, developing new products or whatnot, or like just extending the range of the services that they provide, it comes as logical that they would probably need to develop like a special, let's say like a dedicated unit in their HR department, for instance, where people get super good at onboarding people to their new functions super fast. So that whenever you have like a new workflow, there is a person who specializes in explaining new workflows. And that's like the whole day they kind of work on getting better at explaining new workflows, because like every odd week, they're gonna probably deal with like some new people coming in, or like people from within the organization relearning, like, learning a new task that's gonna be their task for the next X amount of time, like maybe a couple of months. And that there is some person who can really onboard you in one day efficiently and have, let's say, convenient channels that like an sort of institutionalized processes by which you can sort of ask them for guidance and all that. Would that be a good example of it?
Yeah, I mean, it could be an example. I mean, the thing is, the way I look at it, and let me build on that with a few examples. So one point is, this goes right down into the details of your organization. So without getting overly technical, how if you are constantly updating software, how do you take that software from a production environment into a live environment in an efficient, quick way? And there's technology that enables you to do that. And building the ability for your organization to do that is one of the capabilities you need, that sort of flow. Now, that's a pure technology one, but on top of that, you absolutely need the sort of people things you're talking about it. And one of the ways I think about it is, there's a management theorist, Goldratt, who came out with something called the theory of constraints, which is really about production lines and how you do constraints. But I like to apply it to change, and I like to apply it in this way. And I'll say to an organization, so what is it that constrains you from changing? What are the biggest things in the way of you changing? And you can prioritize those. And sometimes it's technology, sometimes it's people. And if you have a prioritized list, you can start at the top and say, right, we're going to remove that constraint. And how are we going to remove it? And it might be that actually our biggest constraint is the speed with which we can adopt new processes. Okay, how could we remove that constraint? Well, one way we could have it is we could have someone who trains people on new processes very quickly. That might not be the biggest problem for your organization, but if it is, that's how you do it. If it's in the technical layer, typically when a digital transformation, it is multifaceted. It's not a matter of one thing or another. It's a whole series of things, and there are lots of solutions. This is already not a new problem, although it's new for some organizations. There are other organizations been grappling with it for years. So there are lots of elements in there, and the point is how you knit those elements together for your organization, but also how you build what is right for you, and how you learn from the things that have gone in the marketplace elsewhere. If I take my example of taking software from production to live, there are some fantastic tools doing that. And if you're a brand new organization, just implement. If you're a retail bank with very old-fashioned mainframe computer systems, it's not easy. It's a real challenge to do that. But that's still a fundamental capability you're going to need in future if you're expecting to be, as in an agile space, launching your minimum viable products on a regular basis and upgrading them quick. Then you need those sorts of capabilities. So there's lots of facets, and one of the best things to do, I find, is to start building a picture with an organization of all the different elements that need to be considered and all the different opportunities there are, and then let's pick the ones that we want to do. One of the challenges is it's very easy to build a business case, for example, to launch a new product, because that product makes you money and therefore you can do that. But the sorts of things I was talking about, the technical capabilities I was talking about, to, for example, take software from production into live, or from development into live, they themselves, they don't directly give you a benefit. They enable other things to give you a benefit quickly. And that can be hard for organizations to get around, especially as sometimes if you've got a very long legacy of complex technology, they can take in themselves years to put in place. So nobody should think that digital transformation is easy, and nobody should think it means one thing. It means different things to different organizations. It really does depend where you're coming from and what are your constraints, is, I think, one of the best ways of thinking on stopping you getting that. Yeah. Does that help? Absolutely.
I love the particular example of this bridge from like having the software developed and actually having it installed in ways that the users can use it, and etc. So this is, as we are getting closer to the end of this conversation, I actually would like to ask you a question that probably complements the question of one of our listeners right now, Ivan, who asks what would be the key takeaways, any particular materials that people will walk away with at the end of the workshop that we are doing in February. I just wanted to also generally ask you what's different and interesting about the program, and what's the sort of point A and point B of this. So like what key takeaways would you like to have participants have at the end of the workshop? Which skills?
Yeah, I mean, I have really strong views about what works and what doesn't work in management education. I think a lot of it doesn't work. But so for me, for a workshop to work, it needs to be practical. So we're going to talk about, practical things. We're going to work around a case study. So we're not just going to be talking theory. Of course, there will be some theory there because we need some theory to underpin it, but we're going to work around a case study. Now we're going to pick up a case study from financial services and we're going to talk about digital transformation. So if you're interested in those fields, obviously the case study is directly relevant. But I think it's important to understand in any management education, it's an example. And the reason we use an example is because it generates much richer debate, much more practical discussion than talking about just theory does. So we want to do that. The other thing is that we want to break out into actual workshops. So we don't just want a team listening to me. There will be some element of interacting in smaller groups. And, all the experience shows that the best learning on these sorts of events happens not just with a lecturer saying, I know this and this is what I'm telling you, but gives people ability to meet their peers and discuss these things and discuss it in a way. And so what we use as a case study as a structured example to do that. So it's a very practical session. There will be some materials and people can walk away with the materials, but I don't think the focus should really be on the materials. The focus should be more on the experience and learning and the discussion you can have and the practical points you should take away. We're very keen to make this a really practical session. And as I say, it's as much a working session as it is a listening session. So, anybody comes, needs to be willing to participate and to take. That doesn't mean you need to have a huge track record, because often the best questions and best input come from people who kind of sitting outside and saying, what you're saying doesn't make sense, and they challenge some of the given. So it doesn't mean that, but it does mean a willingness to participate. And apart from the materials, when I've run these sort of courses in the past, one of the great things that can happen is people can meet peers who then stay in touch, and maybe they're not in competitive industries and they can help each other as well. So think practical, think there will be some theory based on experience, but think practical and think about a working session around a case study. And that kind of gives you an idea of the session.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks a lot for breaking it down. And thanks a lot for being with us today. Thanks for your time, Richard.
My pleasure.
I'm absolutely fascinated and looking forward to the event in February. I will switch back to my Russian self.
Great.
So, dear audience, I wanted to thank you all for being with us today. Just wanted to tell you that when the broadcast is over, you'll see on the screen a link. You could click if you want to register for the workshop. And also you'll see a promo code, which will be valid until Friday, should you decide to join. So don't close this window immediately if you want to get the promo code. So thanks again and hope to see you in February.